Hey everyone, welcome to the EarthRise podcast. This is Derek Barris. I'd initially set out to record this podcast a few weeks ago, which seems like a few lifetimes ago, but you probably know that already. Actually, you probably feel that, which is its own way of knowing. It's not often I can make a statement and be confident that most everyone knows exactly what I mean, but that's the reality we're all living right now. I paused on recording this brief talk because I was forced to confront the contents of it in a way that is likely familiar to you. We all seem to be reevaluating who we are and what our role in society is. Unfortunately, the process of questioning is filled with anxiety. In less than 2 weeks, over 10 million Americans have filed for unemployment. We haven't seen this type of widespread distress in my lifetime, at least. But here we are. Funnily enough, this talk speaks directly to the anxiety we're all feeling. That's why I had to delay on recording it. I had to reflect and be certain that what I'm saying is relevant to this moment now. And I think that it is. I suffered from anxiety disorder for 25 years, as I mentioned during the talk. Although I no longer have panic attacks, anxiety underlies the fabric of my being. In some sense, that's true of everyone. It's just that some of us experience it really intensely for most of our lives, even when we're not in any danger at all. Anxiety becomes a framework for everything we encounter. It sucks, and it's really hard to deal with. But there are methods for working with those feelings of being completely overwhelmed by existence. I can never claim I've been able to overcome anxiety, because I haven't. But I have learned how to work with it, which has become its own form of therapy. A few weeks ago, I was planning on launching EarthRise Wellness, my anxiety coaching program for businesses and individuals. I always took to heart the sentiment to teach what you know, and anxiety is something I know intimately. This talk explains the fundamentals of the program. Now, to be clear, it's not a 4 steps to total happiness promise. Those aren't really possible. We're all unique in our challenges, and we all respond differently to different methods. Yet there are physiological changes in our bodies that we all feel when experiencing anxiety, and those give us a framework that we can collectively understand, even though our circumstances might be different. Now, this isn't about anxiety as a chemical imbalance, which is what we've unfortunately been told so often in order to push pills. That's a topic I spend a lot of time discussing in my next book, Hero's Dose. Anxiety is first and foremost a reaction to your environment and how you navigate through it. And that is what I discuss in this talk and how I coach others. Now, one note, I did have to edit part of the talk based on current events. Just want to be honest about that. I think it's important. There's a moment when I discuss the monetary impact of anxiety. And while those numbers remain true, in fact, the economic impact is probably going to be a lot higher in the coming years. This was one part of the discussion in which I couldn't muster any belief in what I was saying. Maybe it's the rote memorization of numbers that tripped me up. But I suspect it's something deeper. Abraham Maslow famously coined the hierarchy of needs. And the psychologist felt that you couldn't self-actualize until your basic needs are met. In fact, he believed it to be impossible to have self-esteem or even love someone else until you had shelter, food, and community. If you were too busy worrying about how to pay your rent, there's no way you're going to be able to chase after enlightenment. Then last week, I read an article in which the writer, Johann Hari, said that universal basic income should be treated as an antidepressant. As Hari explains in his book, Lost Connections, the differences between depression and anxiety are almost non-existent. They go together. Now, there are subtle differences. Depression doesn't directly create the physiological changes that lead to a panic attack. While you can be anxious and remain hopeful, you can foresee a future in which you're successful, for example. And that pretty much describes me. I've never really experienced the depths of depression, but I have had crippling panic attacks. While there are some distinctions between these two, what they both have to do with is the environment that you live in. And that's actually one of the foundational principles of EarthRise Wellness. You have to change your environment in order to change your mental health. Hari's idea of economic stimulation to produce better mental health outcomes it's brilliant. That's a social solution that should be considered. My work focuses more on your immediate environment, including your habits. Well, point is, these are tough times for a lot of people, including myself and my wife. And reading off numbers in the millions and billions of dollars just felt like I was reciting data that is not recognizable to the majority of how us live. We need shelter, food, and community first. Let's chat about thriving later down the road. So let's talk about self-preservation now. One thing we know about this coronavirus is that it exploits people with weak immune systems. While sometimes that is genetic, your lifestyle profoundly affects your immune system. And what weakens that system? Stress. The thing we fear is more powerful when we fear it. I also read an article recently about how sales of chips, popcorn, Oreos, pretzels, and other junk food is up, while sales of produce is way down. Now, we all know how diet negatively impacts your immune system. And the same goes with exercise. Online classes are booming right now, but I'm guessing not everyone is taking advantage. Yet if you have a few feet of space, you can move. You need to move. Exercise and maintaining a healthy diet are the most effective ways of strengthening your immune system. If you can practice good habits during times of great anxiety, you will certainly be able to use them when this time passes. Now, I know it's strange launching an anti-anxiety program during the most anxious time in recent history, certainly the most anxious in my lifetime. But then again, if these methods have any value, they have to be valuable now. And I believe they are. This is the framework I've lived with for so many years, and every component embodies a mindset that has been around for a very long time. It's not so much an invention as a collaboration, working with a lot of powerful forces that transform anxiety into fuel for creativity. And it is possible, even if it's uncomfortable at first. It's a process. Then again, what isn't? I would argue that a worst fate is living while on autopilot. There might be distress in the current moment, but this is also a moment of richness and possibility. So let's see how we can use anxiety to our advantage. And if you want to learn more about the program, visit derekbarris.com or hit me up on any of my social media channels. In 1951, the British philosopher Alan Watts wrote a timely little book that stands up well to this day. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, a message for an age of anxiety, Watts captures the existential distress we feel as a society careening forward into a dark unknown. Now, given that no one knows the future, insecurity is not a glitch in the matrix, but rather a feature. And we can all take comfort in that. We can even use that feature to our advantage if we're willing to surrender our preconceptions about what we believe must happen. That's harder than it sounds. Humans are natural storytellers. There's a way that our brains work, and it is this. If we don't know information, we write our own stories. That means we don't live in a shared reality as much as we live in a reality constructed of our own experiences and biases. The tension created by living with others who have their own versions can be very overwhelming. And if you don't think we live in different realities, well, have you ever been on social media? Or have you ever been certain a partner was doing something that was nothing like what they were actually doing? We're prone to spin fantastic tales. Just think about how we think about ourselves. We're quick to champion our victories, but we also author our own anxiety. And we need to learn how to write different stories. Fortunately, that is possible. An especially troubling aspect of anxiety is that the sufferer often does not know why they are anxious. The physiological reactions seem to occur out of the blue. This not knowing increases anxiety, reinforcing the negative feedback loop that says, danger is imminent, even though danger is nowhere to be found. And now, living in the healthiest time in the existence of our species, we create an obscene amount of tension when so much of it is unnecessary. Why are we so anxious? What is it about our mental state and environment that makes us feel nervous, sometimes to the point that we're afraid to leave home? What is it about our workplace that evokes a sense of dread or concern? And is that fixable? Why do we allow unfounded stress to dominate our lives? And why are we unable to look one another in the eyes when speaking? We need that mirror of each other. Before we go further, let me explain my relationship to anxiety. I got into an argument with my mother when I was 16. As that surge of rage kicked in, I sprinted around my block. And when I returned home, I went into the bathroom and was convinced that I was having a heart attack. I played hours of basketball every day with no problems, so I knew it wasn't the run. There was something else going on, a sensation I had never felt before. My first panic attack. I ended up in the emergency room. Years later, while living alone above a dry cleaner in Hackensack, another attack put me in another emergency room. And then there was a time I was eating dinner in the East Village when that familiar surge began. Now, my avoidance technique was finding a bathroom to crawl into, so I stood up and made it 5 feet before the room began spiraling and everything went black. Interestingly, after passing out, I walked another 10 feet, smacking right into the wall and landing in some poor woman's lap. By this point, I've had hundreds of panic attacks. Fortunately, my last was in January 2016. I know the date because that's what anxiety does to your brain. It imprints. So when I was able to let it go, that too imprinted. I still occasionally have the physiological effects of panic, but we're nowhere near the intensity. There's no more spiraling. It's become what for so long I wished it would be, a temporary nuisance. Even better, sometimes it acts as fuel for creativity. Interestingly, I ended up working as a patient monitor in the same emergency room that I visited during my first attack. My job was to sit with patients who were at suicide risk and make sure that they didn't leave. I was armed with only a walkie-talkie that went directly to security. Half the time, the patients were passed out on some cocktail of drugs, so I didn't really get to interact with them. But the other half, all the patients that I spent time with, shared one quality. They needed someone to talk to. There's a spectrum when it comes to anxiety. Most of us worry about bills or job security. But when it cripples you to the point where you can't do what's necessary to pay your bills or do your job, then there's a deeper problem going on. If there's dread or fear around what you do every day, you need to investigate the root cause of those feelings. Before I discuss the 4 pillars for managing anxiety that I've constructed, consider this. While every one of us might feel anxious about different external circumstances, we share the same internal physiological processes. If you've trained yourself to think and behave one way, you can retrain yourself to think and behave another. It's no different than going to the gym after a long absence. Sure, you have to start again, but with patience, drive, and diligence, you can change yourself. You can change your relationship with anxiety. All right, first pillar, movement, my favorite. How we move through the world is an indication of who we are. And as such, there are healthy movement patterns and there are damaging ones. We want to focus on the former. Let's make an important distinction here. It's not mind and body. Mind and body share an animal, and that animal is us. All life is a form of movement, whether the movement of our bodies or the movement of our minds, otherwise known as thinking. Without a body, there is no mind. And recognizing that is essential for dealing with anxiety. I mention this because anxiety is not an insurmountable obstacle. It's a physiological reaction to cognitive and emotional stimulation, most often built up over a long time in the environment that you live in. Yes, mind tension can create bodily tension and vice versa, but it's all just tension. And we can use that tension. Many of the same hormones and neurotransmitters, such as norepinephrine, serotonin, cortisol, and dopamine, are all positively affected through movement. Yeah, exercise is one component, but historically speaking, exercise is a new concept. Separating movement from daily life is a recent phenomenon. For most of history, humans had to move. So today we focus on step counters, weight training, cardiovascular exercise, yoga, CrossFit, and those are all important if they help you live a healthier life. But how you move throughout your day, from your posture at work or home to your recovery practices after long bouts of driving and sitting, these are all components of your movement diet. And this diet has less to do with cutting back than adding in the proper nutrients to create better movement patterns. This can be difficult given how set in our ways we become as we age. But moving, especially in new and diverse ways, is essential for alleviating anxiety. Numero dos. Since I just mentioned movement diets, we must also discuss the diets we spend too much of our time thinking about. Nutrition plays a major role in anxiety, and it is way more complex than a silver bullet diet. Depending on your microbiome, genetics, your upbringing, your environment, certain diets might not be right for you. So I'm not going to advocate for any particular diet, because if you want to hit an emotional nerve, try to tell someone what to eat. Instead, I want to focus on two key areas of nutrition that are proving detrimental to physical and mental health: long feeding windows and inflammation. And consider this: around-the-clock availability of food is really new. Not in our lifetime new, but in the last 100 years new, which as a species is very recent. Your digestive and immune systems were built on scarcity. Now, humans are the most adaptable animal on the planet. We can live in extremely diverse environments and survive on the broadest diet of any species. But when an animal built from scarcity is offered excess, bad things are bound to happen. Your feeding window is how many hours you eat over the course of a day, and there are negative consequences to eating over too many hours. Restricting your window results in improved health, yet most Americans' feeding windows are over 14 hours, meaning that your digestive system never gets a break. When digestion is taking up so much energy, it's hard for your body to attend to other duties. Now, habitual eating is usually emotional, not biological. And sadly, when you eat too much over too long a period, and when you snack between meals, your body stores that excess energy as visceral fat. While different people are healthy at different weights, the more visceral fat we store, the more likely we are to have problems. Again, this is not me spewing data, but sharing a lived experience. I grew up overweight. I know well the psychological impact of being bullied. And to be honest, the emotional aspects still affect me. I've just learned how to use that energy as fuel for movement. It might be a coping mechanism, but as an old friend of mine used to say, we're all addicted to something. Better yoga than crack. Specific types of food also matter. Sugar and the carbohydrates that turn into sugar in your body are sources of chronic inflammation. The effect this has on anxiety is well documented. By keeping yourself in a state of inflammation, your fight, flight, or freeze system is constantly on guard. And I also have skin in this game as well. I was vegetarian for nearly 2 decades, and I experienced constant digestive problems. So in 2016, I started eating meat to address my GI problems, such as gastritis and heartburn. Not only did those issues clear up, but my decades-long battle with canker sores ended. I simply wasn't feeding my microbiome the right nutrients. Now, here's what's really interesting, and you may have already caught the timeline. Changing my diet stopped my panic attacks. That was a consequence I wasn't expecting, yet in hindsight it makes sense. Researchers are now realizing that the third nervous system in our gut, the enteric nervous system, is just as influential on our health as the other two that we know very well. In fact, they all communicate. Again, these are systems all part of one body. As a vegetarian, I was eating too many carbohydrates and not enough other macronutrients. Changing my diet changed my life. Now, these two pillars, movement and diet, are regularly discussed aspects of health. If anything, we hear too much about them, but for good reasons. The third does not get nearly enough attention, yet it plays a critical role. In fact, I would say the major role in anxiety, and that is your environment. As Daniel Lieberman, a paleoanthropologist at Harvard, puts it, there is good reason to believe that modern environments contribute to a sizable percentage of mental illnesses, such as anxiety and depressive disorders. And he's right. Lieberman also discusses mismatches. That is, humans are mismatched to our current environment. Although we might not like to admit it, we have too many resources available whenever we want them. And this convenience is killing us. It has made of us a softer, weaker animal than we ever were before. But it doesn't have to be that way. Interestingly, anthropological evidence shows that our ancestors, the ones that had to contend with plagues and lions and droughts and famines and constant wars, they stored less cortisol in their bones than we do. And that discovery led researchers to believe that although our ancestors has had many stressors, once the danger was gone, they were able to relax. Yet we don't seem to be able to do that. Why? We have to consider one of the greatest anxiety-inducing triggers in our environment. We can't focus. We live in a state of constant attentional deficit. We all know the problem with screen time. It took us decades to recognize the public health crisis that cigarettes created. If and when we ever mature enough to grapple with technology addiction, only then will we, as a society, really recognize the problems that this mismatch has caused. And to be clear, I love technology. My father was a computer operator. I had computers growing up my entire life. But with every advance, there is a consequence. Even technologies as basic as electricity, refrigeration, and climate control affect us in the forms of lack of sleep due to the disruption of our circadian rhythms, the prevalence of processed foods, and an inability to exist in temperature extremes, which has a negative impact on our immune systems. All of these are part of the cocktail of modern anxiety. Creating healthier environments takes a bit of work given our reliance on these basic staples. Yet if that translates to anxiety reduction, we need to reconsider how we move through our environment. It doesn't necessarily require an overhaul. We already have a wonderful framework. Perhaps we just need to redecorate. Which all brings us to our final pillar, the art of reframing. Rethinking your movement patterns, your diet, your environment are all essential for dealing with anxiety. After all, anxiety is not only a physiological response. Again, it's the environment that creates that response. You decide how to react to stimulation. Therefore, you can utilize that surge of energy for your benefit. Reframing is possible when you consciously implement changes that make you feel and live better. What at first seems challenging ultimately reduces the chronic tension so many of us live with every day of our lives. Let's think about one more idea. Hormesis. Whereas homeostasis is the balance of your body's systems, such as temperature control and digestion, hormesis is a biological response to low doses of stressors. When you lift weights, you tear your muscles to make them stronger. Though inflammation is usually considered detrimental to your body, during hormesis, such low-grade stressors are actually healthy. Once the process concludes, your body is stronger than before. Anxiety can be understood in the same light. A little bit of stress can be a catalyst for profound change. Anxiety helps you focus and tunes you into your surroundings. During the fight, flight, or freeze response, your hearing sharpens and your vision seeks out potential dangers. Using that focus for your benefit is possible. You just need to practice. The Sufi poet, Rumi, once wrote that the wound is the place where the light enters. The mythologist, Joseph Campbell, pointed out that the hero sets out on their journey because of a wound. Anxiety wounded me for a long time, yet I now understand how to use that energy to help me focus and excel in my life. Shortly before Alan Watts published The Wisdom of Insecurity, W.H. Auden wrote a poem that might have been the inspiration for the subtitle, The Age of Anxiety. In that poem, Auden warns about the dangers of complacency. He writes, "We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the moment and let our illusions die. There are very real dangers in life. We are experiencing that right now as a culture. But then there are the bulk of dangers that only exist in your head. Experiences might have inspired them, but you weren't empowered with the tools for letting them go. Yet such surrender is within your grasp. You have to be vigilant in your training and patient with your reactivity. Learning how to use that force for good is a goal everyone should aim for in this age of anxiety.